Hello everyone, this is Jack. Well, in this video, I'll be covering that rot that occurs at the bottom of these tomatoes. And usually what happens is that the bottom end or the blossom end of the tomatoes has this black spot. And that's why it's called blossom end rot. And it can occur at any growing stage of the tomatoes. It can even occur to the mature tomatoes as well. And usually occurs in the first set of tomatoes that you get in the season. However, it can also occur later on as well. And there are many chatters online why it occurs. It is due to inconsistent watering, calcium deficiency. So we'll be talking about all of those. Now, I don't have any bias or agenda, so I'll be giving you accurate information on everything you need to know about blossom end rot. Now, this occurs mainly in a couple of different varieties of tomatoes, more predominantly than the other, and those are Romas and San Marzanos. Now, it can occur to other types of tomatoes as well. It usually resolves by itself if you follow certain techniques. However, in this video, we'll be covering everything we need to know on how to mitigate it earlier so it does not occur at all, so you can increase your yield and enjoy the fruit. So let's get started.
So we're growing lots of tomatoes this year, and this is the trellis system that we are using, and it's working out really well. We're starting to get lots of tomatoes, and mostly all of the tomatoes are doing good, but some of these, very few of these, have blossom end rot, and that's why I'm making this video. So let's check these Romas. So this Roma is actually doing really good, but let me check the Roma that's one of the first Romas I got, and there you go. It does have blossom end rot. Now this is the earlier tomato, and these are later tomatoes, and these are doing really well. So all of these tomatoes are turning out very, very good.
Now let's get one fact straight. Blossom end rot is caused by deficiency of calcium in the tomato plant, especially in the fruit. Now, I didn't say deficiency of calcium in the soil. I said deficiency of calcium in the plant. Now, growing tomatoes need proper amount of calcium throughout the growth to produce good fruit with good skin and prevent blossom end rot. So if the tomato plants are not able to intake proper amount of calcium, the skin will begin to rot away, and that will cause blossom end rot. Now, lots of people add calcium into the soil. They add lime, which is calcium carbonate. They even add Tums. There's a lot of chatter about adding Tums into the soil that prevents blossom end rot as well. So we'll be talking about adding calcium into the soil as well. But first, we need to understand the issue. So it's not always the deficiency of calcium into the soil. It can also be the inability of a tomato plant to intake calcium from the soil. So your soil could have enough calcium, but the tomato plant is not able to absorb calcium. And the very first reason for that is insufficient watering. Now, you could be watering your tomato plants too much, or you could be letting them dry out. The calcium is only entered into the tomato plant via the roots with proper moisture. So water is a gateway of adding nutrients into the plant. So if the soil dries out and the tomatoes are hanging on the plant and they're growing, and there's no way for calcium to enter into the plant, and that will cause blossom end rot. Now, if you're overwatering your tomato plants, the roots of the tomato plants are going to get waterlogged, which will also prevent calcium to enter into the tomato plants as well. It will inhibit tomato plants' ability to intake calcium. So watering too much and watering too little can both cause to blossom end rot. Now, you might be thinking that in my earlier videos have emphasized stressing tomato plants, actually letting tomato plants dry out a little bit in between watering and stressing the tomato plants so that they can produce a lot more tomatoes. And that is true, but it's only true before the fruit is set on the plant. So right after the fruit appears on the plant, you do not want your tomato plants to dry out. You want to keep consistent moisture in the tomato plants. The stressing out of tomato plants is only to encourage the tomato plants to produce fruit. So once the tomato plant has flowers and is starting to produce fruit, you don't want to stress out your tomatoes as well. So there's no contradiction there. I just wanted to clear that out. Also, never water the tomato plants from top down. Do not get the foliage of tomato plants wet. Always water the tomato plants from the bottom. Water the roots, not the foliage. And also, always keep the roots of the tomato plants with even moisture, with consistent watering, and mulch the tomato plants as well, which will help in retaining moisture in the tomato plants. Now, the second reason why the tomato plants are not intaking proper amount of calcium is the pH level of your soil. Maybe it's too acidic or too alkaline. Tomato plants like pH between 6.5 and 7.0. So if your pH is either too alkaline, it's above 7.0, or it's too acidic, if it's 5.5, 6.0 or such, the tomato plants will not be able to intake proper nutrients from the soil either. So always test your soil, make sure your soil is around 6.5 to 7.0 pH. Quick tip, to increase the pH level of your soil to make soil more alkaline, add lime into the soil, and to decrease the pH level of the soil to make soil more acidic, add sulfur. So another reason that your tomato plants are unable to intake calcium is too much growth in too little time. So if you add a lot of nitrogen into your ground, a lot of fertilizer, you'll get a lot of leafy growth in tomato plants. The tomato plants will grow very rapidly, and the growth is not being able to coincide with the ability to take calcium into the plant. So the roots are not able to supply enough calcium to accommodate all the growth of leaves in the plant, and then the fruit sets and plant needs even more calcium. So always use slow release fertilizer and use low nitrogen fertilizer, and the fertilizer that is rich in phosphorus and potassium.
Last year I let my tomatoes go because I didn't have enough time, but this year all the tomatoes are nicely staked and pruned as well. These tomatoes are loaded. Look at these nice tomatoes.
Now the last reason for tomatoes' inability to take calcium has to do with cultivating soil right next to the tomato plant. So if the weeds are growing and you're going with a weeding hoe or cultivating tools right next to the tomato plants, you're going to disturb the roots or cut the roots or damage the roots. So if the roots are damaged, the roots will not be able to absorb enough calcium to supply calcium to the plants, which will cause blossom end rot. Now it's not always plants' inability to intake calcium. It can also be deficiency of calcium into the soil as well. So you can test your soil and see how much calcium is in the soil too. However, if you have clay soil, that's probably not going to be the reason. If you have loamy soil, sandy soil, in which fertilizer moves rather quickly into the soil, so that could be the reason that you're having blossom end rot, is the deficiency of calcium in the soil. Now there are various ways to add calcium in the soil as well, and one of the best ways to add calcium is natural ways, such as using eggshells, oyster shells, bone meal. But if you're going to approach this method, you need to crush oyster shells and eggshells very finely and then add it into your garden in fall. So in early winter or in fall, before you actually get into spring and start planting tomatoes, because the eggshells and oyster shells need enough time to break down into the soil to release calcium. If you start adding eggshells into the soil while the tomatoes are growing, that will not make any difference. Now another way to add calcium to the soil is adding lime, which is calcium carbonate, and be careful about doing that. Like I said earlier, it can also raise the pH level of your soil. So if your soil is already too alkaline, if your soil is like, let's say 7.0, and if you add more lime into the soil, it'll make it more alkaline, which will cause tomato plants stressed out because they are not able to intake proper nutrients because of imbalance of pH as well. Now there are other ways to add a lot of calcium to the soil, such as gypsum. Gypsum is 22% calcium, and people have also talked about adding Tums, which is also calcium carbonate. You know, we take Tums when we have acidity. So people have used Tums. I haven't personally used Tums because there are lots of other additives into the Tums as well, such as coloring, sucrose, and there's lots of other stuff that we humans can consume, which is not going to harm the plants if you add it into your soil. However, I don't like to add stuff into the soil that doesn't belong there. And since we're certified organic, those ingredients are not compatible with organic gardening, organic farming. And another reason is that adding Tums is not economical. Tums cost a lot. And I can basically add gypsum into the soil or lime into the soil because we have naturally acidic soil, and that is much more cost effective than adding Tums. And Tums actually comes out to be like 70 to 80 times more costly than adding lime and gypsum into the soil. That's how costly it is if you want to do it on a large scale. There are additional products that you can also use to combat blossom end rot as well, such as calcium nitrate and rot stop. And rot stop is a foliar spray that you can apply to your plants too. So I hope you have enough information to stop blossom end rot and actually enjoy your fruit. However, if you do end up getting some blossom end rot, you can always just cut it off and actually use the tomato. There's nothing wrong with the tomato itself, and you can always use it. And there's no point in using fungicides, pesticides, insecticides on blossom end rot, because as we covered, the issues concerning blossom end rot has nothing to do with fungus, pests, or insects. So refrain from using those products to combat blossom end rot. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in another video.